I'm Mike Merryman-Lotze. Thank you very much for having me. This is, I guess, feel like I've been traveling and bouncing around for the last few weekends. This week here, last weekend in Washington, D.C., and the weekend before that I was in Gaza. It's been quite a shift to move from Gaza one week to Washington, D.C., the center of political power in this country, the next week to here in New York City a week later. As I thought about what to speak about today, I wanted to start out by talking about Gaza. I've been one of the few, I think, Americans who's been privileged over the last nine years to have pretty much continuous access to Gaza. First through my work with Save the Children, where I was the program director in Jerusalem and managed work in Gaza and had a permit from 2007 through 2010 to enter and exit Gaza. And then over the last 6 years, yeah. Okay, we'll check it.
Let's try, there's a thing we can check.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I'm hearing you, but
yeah.
That's good.
Not seeing it.
There we go. Yeah, the mute button turns it on. There
All right,
we go.
there we go. Okay. Let's see if that works better. Yeah.
Visually, let me just.
Yeah. All right, we can move it down. Yeah. Move it down. Yeah. All right. Okay. So as I was saying, I've been privileged to enter and visit Gaza pretty continuously over the last 9 years, and that period of entering in and out of Gaza has really paralleled the Gaza blockade, which has been in effect since 2006, first being imposed after Hamas was elected into the Palestinian Authority, and then tightened in 2007 when Hamas took control of Gaza and split with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. That blockade in Gaza has really stopped all of life for Gazans. It means that Palestinians in Gaza can't leave the Gaza Strip except for a few individuals who have permits. It means that Palestinians from the West Bank can't come and visit family in Gaza. It means that with the exception of those of us who work for humanitarian organizations or diplomats or a few journalists, nobody from the outside world can enter in and out of Gaza. It means that the goods needed to produce products in Gaza cannot enter in, effectively destroying the economy in Gaza. It means that the goods needed to rebuild homes in Gaza cannot enter, leaving thousands homeless. It means that the goods that are produced in Gaza cannot exit Gaza, also again cutting off the economy of Gaza from the rest of the world. Gaza is really a surreal place, and that sense of the surreal starts from the moment that you enter into Gaza. As you pass through the Erez checkpoint from Israel to come into Gaza, you enter into a no man's land, and that no man's land stretches for approximately half a mile or so, and you walk through an encaged tunnel. It's about as wide as two of these, the pathway here in the middle of the meeting house, and is encaged all of the way, and so you're walking through this encaged tunnel for half a mile from the Israeli checkpoint to the Palestinian side where you are welcomed into Gaza. On either side of that is now an open field covered with grass and plants that are growing up. But over the last 9 years, what I've watched is that field transform from a field of rubble into that grassy covered plain. And that rubble is the remains of the Gaza industrial zone, an industrial zone that was built there at Erez during the peace process years and before to provide income and opportunity for Palestinians in Gaza, destroyed during the Second Intifada and afterwards by Israel during its military operations in Gaza. The first building that you see now in Gaza is a huge apartment block that stretches for several blocks. And when I entered into Gaza in 2014, shortly after the 2014 attacks there in Gaza, that building was a visual representation of what had happened there in Gaza. Sections of the building were just completely destroyed, other parts damaged severely from mortars and shooting, families displaced from that building. Going back in this time, sections of that building have been taken down, but others still unrepaired because the goods that you need to be able to do reconstruction in Gaza can't come in as a result of the blockade, are now re-inhabited. And so you see these homes where cloth has been put over the walls, blocking out the holes, kids playing in front of the building, and yet amazing damage and destruction still there. And that one building is just one of many that's like that. It was estimated that over 100,000 people were displaced as a result of the war in 2014. That over 16,000 homes were damaged or severely damaged or destroyed during that conflict. At this point, approximately 30% of those homes have been repaired to the point where they can be re-inhabited. But what that means is that there are 65,000 people who remain homeless in Gaza 2 years after the end of that war. The big thing that's stopping that's stopping the reconstruction, is the blockade. It's the imposition of limitations on the imports of goods into Gaza, the import of cement, the import of rebar, the import of wood that's more than 4 inches wide, the import of pipes, the import of anything else that's needed to build basic items that are not items that are used to produce weapons. They're not items that are used for any kind of military actions. They're the things that average people need to live their lives. And that blockade is yes, imposed by Israel, but it's a blockade that also receives the support of the U.S. government. It receives the support of the international community. And in some ways, there was a negotiation over the entry of goods that happened after the end of the 2014 war that was supposed to increase the import of goods into Gaza. That negotiation has resulted in no change and has made the United Nations and other organizations complicit in the imposition of a blockade on Gaza. And so that's something that really we need to recognize, that it's not simply the responsibility of Israel for the blockade and its impacts on Gaza, it's the responsibility of the international community. But as we talk about BDS, we can take that even a step further. That going into Gaza then, this time I drove through the neighborhood of Shaja'iyya. One of my colleagues in Gaza is from Shaja'iyya, and Shaja'iyya is a neighborhood on the eastern side of Gaza City where some of the most intensive fighting happened in 2014. Whole sections of that neighborhood were destroyed, houses taken down, blocks emptied, families displaced. And that reminded me in many ways of entering into Gaza in 2009 after Operation Cast Lead and the fighting that happened then. At that point, I entered shortly after the end of the war, and I entered into the areas of Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia along the borders of Gaza. And it's something really what we saw at that point is almost impossible to describe. It was city blocks of rubble, homes demolished, flattened, areas as big as any of these city blocks here, just piles of rubble, one house after another demolished. I saw similar things in Dahia in South Beirut in 2006, and the same thing happened in 2002 in Jenin. I was there in the refugee camp only a week or so after the end of the incursions by the Israeli military into that camp. You know, in that instance, Caterpillar D9 bulldozers were brought into the middle of the crowded refugee camp and used to demolish a huge portion of the middle of the camp. This was done after fighting ended. And I remember entering into the camp and entering into the area that was cleared while families were digging out their goods from underneath the rubble, and seeing a family pulling a wheelchair out from underneath the crushed rubble of a home, where a home had been pushed down on top of people who were inside, killing them, those who were there. One of the Caterpillar bulldozer drivers who was there in the camp and who demolished that went by the call name Curdy Bear, and there was a long interview with him in the Haaretz newspaper shortly after those incursions in 2002. And he talked about driving through the camp while drinking, and he said how he had created a stadium for the Palestinians in the middle of the camp. He talked about kind of the excessive use of force to demolish all of those homes. And this is where we come back to BDS, that those actions, whether it's in Jenin refugee camp in 2002, or southern Lebanon in 2006, or Gaza in 2009, or 2012, or 2014, or what's the next time? All of those things were done with Caterpillar D9 bulldozers. Those bulldozers are produced here in the United States for export under the Foreign Military Sales Program. They are produced to be weaponized, they are produced to be armored, they are sold as weapons to the Israeli military. Now, Caterpillar knows well how those bulldozers are used. They know that they're used to demolish homes. And not only in those military operations, right now there are up to 10,000 homes in Jerusalem that are slated for demolition because they aren't built with permits, because Palestinians aren't given permits to build. There are villages, 15 at least in the West Bank, that are slated for demolition, the whole village, because Israel says that those villages are in areas either slated for settlement construction or for use by the military. There are villages in the south of Israel, in the Negev, that have been demolished one time after another to make way for the building of Jewish communities. Those also are demolished, often with the Caterpillar bulldozers. Caterpillar knows this. Human Rights Watch has reported on this. Amnesty International has reported on this. Churches have gone to Caterpillar and said, change your behavior. Don't sell these bulldozers. You know how they were going to be used. Caterpillar has said, I'm sorry, these are products that we produce, we're going to sell them. And so that, and again, is where BDS comes in. It says to that company, we are going to hold you accountable. We who are here in the US see how your products are being used. We see that these are not being used for civilian purposes. We see that these products are being used for human rights abuses. We see that you are taking no action to end your responsibility in that behavior, and therefore we are not going to invest in your company until your behavior changes. In other instances, it's we are not going to buy your product until your company behavior changes. So maybe stepping back from that conversation a little bit to, well, what is BDS, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. BDS is a process for pushing for nonviolent change, responding to a call that was made by Palestinian civil society in 2005. In 2005, 1 year after the International Court of Justice ruled that the route of the wall that Israel was building through the West Bank was illegal, Palestinian civil society came together and said, we've been failed by the international community. This ruling has been in place for a year without impact. The international community peace process has gone on for impact. What we need is change that comes not through the diplomatic process, but change that people can bring to this situation. We need change that will bring to us a just peace. And they named in that call what they said needed to be done to achieve or to realize a just peace. So Palestinian civil society said that they wanted three things to happen for a just peace to be realized. Those three things are, one, an end to the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and other territories controlled by Israel. Two, recognition and address of the right of return or rights for Palestinian refugees. And three, equality between Palestinians and Israelis before the law. Those three things are what Palestinians have said that they think need to be the rights addressed in order to achieve a just and lasting peace. For AFSC, those things weren't controversial. As an organization, we began supporting calling for an end to the occupation in 1970. Excuse me. We have been involved in, our first involvement in Israel and Palestine began in 1948 when we helped to set up the refugee camps in Gaza. And if you read through those early documents that AFSC's staff in Gaza wrote in the late 1940s and early 1950s, even then they were saying if the issue of refugees is not addressed justly, if refugees aren't allowed to return, then this conflict will drag on for decades. And that recognition is something that we need to recognize today, that the core of the conflict isn't simply a drawing of borders along the 67 lines, it's addressing things that go back further, including the rights of refugees. And equality for Quakers is just a basic tenet of faith. It's something that we say all people are equal and they need to be treated as such. And so when we began to consider then the Palestinian call, those things that Palestinians were saying were core to achieving a just peace were not really things that were controversial for us. But Palestinians moved then from saying that these are things that need to be addressed for achieving a just peace to then a call for action. And their call for action was, we want the international community to implement, or those who are around the world, to use boycott, divestment, and sanctions tactics to target Israel and companies doing business in Israel as a way of pushing forward for rights, for transformation, and a way of ending abuses. And so we, as an organization, and others around the world, have responded to that call. Not by saying anything necessarily about the core rights that are at the beginning. That's not what we're being asked to respond to. That's a statement by Palestinians about what they believe. What we have said is that we do think that boycotts, divestment, and sanctions as nonviolent tactics for social change are tactics that can, in this situation, bring change, and that we will respond to the call by Palestinian civil society. When AFSC's board considered what do we do in response to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions call, how do we as an organization respond, they spent several years really looking through that, looking at what that would mean for us as an organization. And when they actually came out with a position, it wasn't one that said, oh, we support boycott, divestment, and sanctions in the context of Palestine and Israel. What they said was, we support economic activism. It's a much broader statement, but it's one that I think people need to take into account. Economic activism is something that many of us have engaged in many instances. For Quakers, it goes back, as was noted, to the free produce movement, to the 1800s, to the attempts to end slavery. Then, we've supported boycotts and divestments in the 60s in the civil rights movement. We supported the anti-apartheid movement. We supported the farm worker movement. We supported the Immokalee workers. We, in this current situation, are supporting prison divestment and boycotts of companies that are involved in the prison industry. We support campaigns on many, many different issues. And so what they said was, boycott, divestment, and sanctions in Israel and Palestine can't be an exception to that rule. And that for all of us, this whole idea that we need to make a special decision in this one context about the use of these tactics is perhaps exceptionalizing things in a way that is irresponsible. That what we should be saying is that Israel is no exception to our use of these tactics. That a boycott against a company because of its behavior in Israel and Palestine is no different than a boycott of a company in any other context. A divestment in that context is not different than a divestment in any other context. That Palestinians' call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is, for any of us who are supportive of nonviolent social action, something that we shouldn't be seeing as an exception to our rules. It's something that we should be able to support. And if we look at the behavior of the companies that are being targeted, they're companies that all of us should be concerned about. They're companies like Remax in the campaign that Codepink is running, which is selling properties and doing business in settlements in the West Bank in violation of international law. It's companies like Veolia, which now has ended its operations in the West Bank, largely due to BDS pressure and the campaigns that were put against it, but that also was running segregated bus lines through the West Bank, connecting Israel to settlements, but not running through Palestinian villages or on roads that Palestinians could travel on. It was, it's companies like SodaStream, which also has changed, moved its production facilities out of the settlement where it was located and into another location, in large part because of the pressure from the BDS movement. It is a movement that is looking to hold companies accountable for the behaviors. It's a movement that's saying that all of us, through the purchases we make, through the actions that we take, are in ways complicit in what's happening in Israel and Palestine, but also not only can we be complicit, but each of us, through the actions that we take, through the purchases that we choose not to make, through the investments that we pull back, have a voice in the behavior of companies, have a voice in the behavior, in the way that things are done, that can change actions that are happening on the ground. And it's not a movement that's saying that the primary responsibility for bringing change rests with these companies. These companies' behaviors are abusive and they need to change, but it's also not saying that changing the company's behavior is what ultimately the final goal is. The final goal is political change. It is ending the occupation. It is achieving equality. It is realizing justice for refugees. But that will change as the discourse around Israel-Palestine changes in this country. As people grow to understand the realities on the ground as lived by Palestinians, as experienced by people who are there. It will change as people understand the abusive nature of the situation, the structural injustice and legal inequality that exists between Palestinians and Israelis. It will change as people stand up and say that that is not something that we can stand for. And that as they do that, then push for political change as well and say, not only is this something that I won't stand for, but I demand that my legislature is not stand by this as well. And we're starting to see some of that transformation of the community level activism into changes at the political level. We've seen that in a letter that was signed around the Leahy law last year. That's a law for holding units in foreign militaries accountable if they receive U.S. funding. And there was a letter by more than 20 representatives here in the U.S. government that called for accountability for Israel and investigation into possible extrajudicial executions and assassinations by the Israeli military. There have been 20 representatives signed on to a letter calling for a special envoy for Palestinian children. Those are relatively small numbers if you look at the political establishment, but 20 calling for a special envoy for Palestinian children, 20 representatives, is 20 more than you had 2 years ago. And so there is political movement. And that's really where we are in this movement. And with BDS, yes, it's about accountability, but it's also about these conversations that we're having here. It's about the conversations that anybody who's supporting a campaign have with their neighbors and with anybody else who's around in their community. It's about how we push these things at the political establishment. And you better believe that the political establishment is watching. And that's where also these laws come in. It's not just the law here in New York that's passed, or the draft law that's that's here in New York City, or the law that will likely pass in Pennsylvania this week. It's laws in 21 other states that are on the books that are being pushed. And you can say that in some ways is frightening, in some ways is something that is concerning, and yet at the same time it's a sign of desperation to me. It's a sign that the only way to challenge a grassroots movement is through political action that's going to be struck down at the court level, because it's a violation of basic speech rights. That the right to boycott is something that the Supreme Court has said over and over again is a fundamental right for all of us. And so it's the political establishment, it's the elite, it's those with power who are saying desperately, we need to stop this. And yet that won't stop it. And so all of us need to not be overly concerned about these laws that are passing, because realistically, they don't impact most of us. How many of us have a contract with the state of New York? I don't. I don't think any of you do. A few places do, but not most. And there will be, I think, legal challenges to say, this has to end, and those legal challenges will probably win. But this is the money that's coming in to challenge BDS. $26 million from the Israeli government to challenge BDS. $50 million raised in a weekend by Adelson and others to challenge BDS and others against a movement that, at most, through all of the funded organizations, has just a tiny fraction of that amount of money, but the energy of community activists who don't need money and who can bring change. And through that process, through accountability, we can bring change for those people in Gaza, for people in Palestine, for people in Israel. So I'd encourage you, if you have questions about BDS, we will be here for later, and I'm sure Medea will say more about this and about other areas in the Middle East where economic activism has relevance and where change can be pushed as we continue, all of us together, to call for accountability.
Thank you so much, Mike. And as you said, we're going to have a Q&A after this, so prepare your questions. And Medea, this is all yours.
Just not tall enough for this.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
You can also have a walking mic. If
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's do that.
Sorry. What do you call it? Vertically impaired? BDS, we have a huge fight ahead of us, and I would say in general that would give us some extra incentive and oomph, and I hope it does. I was a little saddened, having just come from Boston, where there were students from the Students for Justice in Palestine in Northeastern University, and they had been attacked. And I thought, well, now after being attacked, more people will have joined, and it was actually just the opposite, that things had really calmed down, that students were afraid. And so we've got to really be there for the students, for these individuals like professors and others who get personally attacked, and also to show that when anybody is attacked, that we make sure that these movements really grow. Is this?
You can try this as well if you
is this?
want. I'm going to have a little more.
And I think this feedback.
Better?
Yeah, this is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
I'll just turn off the other one.
Where'd it go?
That's great.
Is this better? Wow. Wow. I also, this is the first time that I'm at an event where we put these two issues together, of focusing on the Israel-Palestine issue and then Saudi Arabia. And I love that, and I think it's really important to do, because sometimes when I go out speaking about Saudi Arabia, I feel like, even though I'm careful to say this is not to feed into Islamophobia, it somehow feels that it can ease into that, because I'm talking about a very repressive government that is spreading its version of Islam around. And so I think bringing these two issues together is a good way to do that. I know that when I have focused on the issue of Israel-Palestine, many of my relatives and friends in the Jewish community would say, why do you keep picking on Israel? You know, what about all these repressive Arab governments? And so showing that we're not just, quote, picking on Israel is a good thing. In the movement that we're trying to build around Saudi Arabia, we are in step one. When you look at the Israel-Palestine issue, we have done so much fabulous work to educate people. I remember at the beginning of Codepink, which was in 2002, this was a hot issue, and we lost a lot of people in Codepink because we started taking on the Palestine issue. It was so contentious. Now it's sort of taken for granted that if you're a really progressive group, you're going to have a good position on Palestinian human rights. In the case of Saudi Arabia, even the progressive community does not know about Saudi Arabia. So that's why I wrote this book, which is really a very basic primer. I would say it's a kind of Saudi Arabia 101, to just educate people and start the beginnings of a movement going on this. I'll be quick because we want to really focus on what we can do, but in the book, I go into the founding of Saudi Arabia, how it was built on the basis of this very perverted form of Islam known as Wahhabism, how the internal workings of Saudi Arabia make it one of the most repressive governments in the world. That while the U.S. has been focusing on Iran and how awful Iran is because their elections are not free and fair, Saudi Arabia, there are no elections. There are no elections for a president, a prime minister, no Congress, no assembly, and it is a country that quashes dissent in a terrible way, uses the death penalty for many forms of nonviolent dissent or homosexuality or sorcery or insulting Islam or spreading atheism. The majority of the way that the death penalty is implemented is by beheadings. There are large portions of the population that are discriminated against simply based, for example, on gender. Women are not only forced to cover up in public, and it's the most gender segregated society in the world, the only country in the world where women can't drive, but it's also based on a guardianship system where women from the day they're born to the day they die have to have a male legal guardian to approve or disapprove of the most important decisions they should be able to make on their own in their lives. It's also a country that, even though it's based on a theocracy, it has no respect for any other forms of religion or form of practicing Islam. For example, if you are part of the minority Shia community, discriminated against. If you are not a Muslim, and there are many non-Muslims because of the large migrant population, in fact there's 2 million people who are Christians living there, it's the only country in the world where you couldn't build a church or any non-Muslim place of worship. And the U.S. is supposed to have a study every year that decides which countries are the worst in terms of religious tolerance, and if they come in at the bottom, they're supposed to get sanctioned. Every year the study is done. Countries like North Korea, Burma, come in at the bottom, and they are indeed sanctioned, but Saudi Arabia comes in at the bottom year after year after year, is not sanctioned because the State Department has given an indefinite waiver to Saudi Arabia. So I mentioned the migrant population. Of the 30 million people in Saudi Arabia, 10 million of them are migrant workers, the majority of them coming from very poor countries and treated as indentured servants, worked extremely hard, have very few rights, and in fact, if they come to Saudi Arabia and decide that they were sold a faulty bill of goods, that their employer is terrible, that they want to go back home, they're not even allowed to leave the country without an exit visa given to them by their employer. Slavery was not abolished until 1962, and this is a modern day form of slavery. I mentioned that the country was built on what many people in the Muslim world call a perversion, not a version of Islam. And that version of Wahhabism has been spread now to many places around the world. This is a relatively new phenomenon that started in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, where the Saudis were very worried about the spread of the Iranian Shia version of Islam and wanted to get their version of Islam spread around the world and use the vast amount of resources it has from the oil to build thousands of places of worship as well as schools and train the imams and train the teachers in Saudi Arabia, send them back to their homes, pay their salaries. And what we have is, in many places around the world, the intolerant version of Islam that's creeping in thanks to Saudi Arabia. We see, even here in the United States, the connections with the 9/11 attack, that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, that our government has kept us from getting the vast documentation that our FBI has done to see just how high up the chain the connections were between the hijackers and people in the Saudi government. And that's why 9/11 families have been fighting for 15 years to get the right to sue Saudi Arabia in U.S. courts, something that they just got the right to do last month. President Obama vetoed that, and Congress miraculously overruled that veto. And we shall see if in the coming months, through the court process, the discovery process, we're able to know more about the relationship of the hijackers and people inside the Saudi government. In the meantime, we do know that people in the Saudi government have been financing and arming groups like Al-Qaeda and even ISIS because of the WikiLeaks cables that have come out. We see Hillary Clinton herself kind of tearing her hair out and say, what are we going to do about these Saudis? They keep funding these fundamentalist groups. And as late as 2014, we've seen cables that said, what are we going to do about the Saudis funding ISIS as a way to get at Assad in Syria? So the connections between Saudi Arabia and terrorist organizations have been very clear over the years, but you have to then scratch your head and say, why is the United States, which as just came out in a new study has spent $5 billion fighting a war on terror, become such a close ally of the country that is most responsible for spreading terrorism? Well, when you go back to the founding of Saudi Arabia, it really was all about oil. But that has changed over the years because only 13% of the oil from Saudi Arabia comes into the United States right now, and the U.S. could get that from somewhere else. In the meantime, what has crept into this relationship is the sale of weapons. And just like Mike was talking about in the case of Israel, it's even more so in the case of Saudi Arabia. When you look at the amount of weapons that we, quote, give to Israel, it has been at about $3 billion a year. Multiply that by 8 years of the Obama administration, you get $24 billion. In the case of Saudi Arabia, just under Obama, it's been $115 billion of sales of U.S. weapons. The amount is just staggering. How have the Saudis used those weapons? Well, they've used them to quash internal dissent. They've used them to crush democratic uprisings like in neighboring Bahrain. And then for the last 19 months, they've been using them to pound away at Yemen, already the poorest country in the Arab world, and now absolutely devastated by Saudi bombings, using U.S. weapons, using U.S. munitions, using U.S. airplanes, using U.S. logistical support to refuel the airplanes in the air, using U.S. intelligence, and using U.S. diplomatic cover. So much so that even one of the senators from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, has said that the Yemenis see this as a U.S. war and say that the U.S. has blood on its hands. So we have just been at the point of starting to make some inroads into this issue of weapons sales. And before I go into that, I just want to say one other thing, that when you wonder why there is no movement in the U.S., even in the peace movement around Saudi Arabia, it's a couple of different things. One, it's very difficult, almost impossible for people to go into Saudi Arabia, to visit, to see for themselves, for journalists to go in. So that kind of isolation that the Saudis government has done on purpose. The other is that the Saudis have spread their wealth in another way to buy complicity. And they have given money to Ivy League universities. I was just in New Haven, Connecticut, where there was a $10 million grant to the Yale Law School, no less. A law school where Saudi Arabia doesn't have the rule of law, they don't even have a constitution, and they've been funding the law school for Yale. They also spread their money around to think tanks in Washington, D.C., from left to middle to liberal. You might know the Brookings Institute or the Atlantic Council, all getting money from Saudi Arabia. And then there are foundations, some well-known foundations like the Clinton Foundation that gets between $10 and $25 million from the Saudis. I was at a hearing where John McCain, as head of the Armed Services Committee, was grilling the U.S. Head of the Joint Chief of Staffs and around terrorism to get him to say that Iran was the worst spreader of terrorism in the world, and going on and on how bad the Iranians are. And I couldn't help myself. Sometimes you just got to blurt things out in these hearings, and I blurted out, "Why do you never talk about the influence of Saudi Arabia?" And as he was calling the police to get me out, I quickly Googled John McCain and Saudi Arabia and realized that his foundation had taken $1 million from the Saudis. We also see that Saudi Arabia has hired many, many lobby groups. They don't have the same kind of lobby that Israel has, AIPAC, that not just has money, but has really a grassroots. I mean, you have to admit that AIPAC has people on the ground, that they're able to mobilize. They bring 6,000 people to their annual gathering in Washington, D.C. Saudi Arabia doesn't have anything like that at the grassroots, but they do have the money that they have used to hire PR firms. And now there are 10 PR firms in Washington, D.C. that are paid foreign agents of the Saudi government. And they tend, within those firms, to have former senators that are Republican, that are Democrat, Congress people. One of the groups is called the Podesta Group. You might have heard of any famous people with the Podesta name. Anybody know anybody? John Podesta. John Podesta is the chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. His brother is Tony Podesta. The two of them started the Podesta Group as a lobby group, and his brother, Tony Podesta, is a paid foreign agent for the Saudi government, getting $140,000 a month from Saudi Arabia to represent that repressive regime. So when you wonder why we don't hear more about how bad the Saudis are, put those factors together. It's really the war in Yemen that has brought this issue to light. And it's very important that it's come to light, and we've gotten some people in Congress to start paying attention to this. We have had one victory so far, and that has been about the sale of cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia. You might know that cluster bombs for the international community are banned, but the United States hasn't signed on to that ban. So there was a company, Textron, based in New England, that has continued to produce cluster bombs and sell them to Saudi Arabia. Human Rights Watch put out a devastating report about how they're being used in Saudi Arabia, by Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen. And this sparked a lot of controversy in Congress and got a lot of not only the traditional sort of peace groups, but also the humanitarian community, which is much larger than we are, to get involved. So you have groups like the Red Cross, you have groups like Oxfam, Save the Children, who became involved in a lobby campaign. And thanks to that big lobby campaign, and thanks to the Quakers, who for 6 years were protesting in front of the Textron production facilities, and also in front of the headquarters of Textron, finally got President Obama to put a halt to the sale of cluster bombs, and more important than that, got Textron to say they would no longer produce cluster bombs. So let's give a hand to the Quakers who worked so hard on that. Oh, so cluster bomb is a munition that breaks up into small bomblets that are then left on the ground and continue to kill people long after the war ends. And those people tend to be farmers walking in their fields, children picking up what looks like something interesting, and it blows up and blows off their legs or kills them. So where do we go from here? One is we need to focus on the broader issue of weapons sales. Just under Obama, there have been 43 different weapons deals, and Congress has rubber-stamped every single one of them. Cluster bombs is one tiny victory. We need to go after the large weapon sales in general. And I'm just going to pass around a flyer that we have. In fact, Heike, you have some you could pass out down there. I'll put these on this side if you could go on. I think you have some more of them there on the other side, to call your Congress people and just with the very simple message, no weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. There will be more and more deals coming up, and we've got to try to stop them. An important thing to remember on this, it's not just about the war in Yemen. There is a tentative ceasefire. It doesn't look like it's holding, but hopefully, one day there will be peace talks and an end to the war in Yemen. We want to stop the sale of weapons, not just because how they're being used in Yemen, but because of the repressive nature of the Saudi regime in general. The other things we want to do is to stigmatize those companies, think tanks, universities, lobby groups that are taking money from the Saudis with a campaign of no dirty dollars from dictators. And we need a lot of help on that because, frankly, we don't have the strength to do that right now. We also need some ideas. For example, Uber just got a big investment from Saudi Arabia of $3.5 billion, enough to get them a seat on the board. We could think of a campaign around Uber that would say, don't take any more money from Saudi, don't let one of the Saudi government agents be sitting on your board. We haven't done the research like we've done around Palestine to find the right targets, to find the right ways to approach those targets. So this is really taking baby steps right now and needs a lot of support from people who can do some of this research, come up with some of these ideas. The other thing we can certainly do is support some of the people inside Saudi Arabia that are working to change their own country. When you look at BDS, it came from the Palestinian civil society. There is not a civil society in Saudi Arabia. They are not allowed to have these kind of groups. And people who start doing the kind of things of standing up and saying, let's have a global campaign to focus attention on the repression in Saudi Arabia would find themselves in prison, if not beheaded. So it's very hard to do this work without our counterparts inside Saudi Arabia. So it has to be a little different from the way that we do it on Palestine. There are Saudis who live in the diaspora who are working with us, who would really like to see this happen. But in the meantime, they say what you have to do is more work to support the growth of a civil society inside Saudi Arabia. There are human rights lawyers, there are people that we can connect with. The internet really gives us a way to connect with them, but we have to do more to keep them out of jail and to move the government to allow for more space. The people that we are in touch with say we don't want to overthrow the regime, because if it were overthrown, when you don't have a civil society, what would come in its place? They look at Syria, Iraq, Libya, and say it would be chaos, and the groups that would come in would be groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. What we want to do is reform our society, and we need the help and the push that the U.S. government is not doing to allow such basic things as the functioning of non-governmental organizations. And lastly, I want to bring it back to the issue that Mike talked about, that this is really all a reflection of the greed of our weapons industry and the chokehold that our weapons industry has on our Congress and on our White House. I was so excited when the Pope was here and he was speaking before Congress, and he said, "Why are we selling deadly weapons to those who plan to inflict untold suffering on individuals and society? Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply for money. Money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood. In the face of this shameful and culpable silence, it is our duty to confront the problem and stop the arms trade." So people in Congress jumped up and were clapping. The very people who are constantly taking money from the weapons industry because they are manufacturing these weapons in every district in our country, and then giving money to the Congress people who then turn around and say, you couldn't possibly stop the production of these weapons or stop these weapon sales because this means jobs in my district. So they are corrupt, our system is corrupt, and it's the weapons industry that is really dictating our foreign policy. So as we criticize the government of Israel, as we criticize the government of Saudi Arabia, let's make sure that we understand our job is to criticize our own government. Our job is to stop our government from being run by the military-industrial complex that General Eisenhower warned us about back in the 1950s. And our job, I think, as activists, is to start a very strong campaign that says, divest from the weapons industry. The way the Palestinian movement has picked certain targets like Caterpillar, like Hewlett-Packard, the way the environmentalists have picked the fossil fuel industry and gone after them, we have to have a campaign that goes into the endowments of universities, the pension funds, anywhere we can, and say, as the Pope did, that selling weapons, your hands are drenched in blood. We have to divest ourselves from the weapons industry. Thank you.
If you wish, just have someone else read what's on your card, or I can pass the mic to you and you can ask your question yourself, and then Mike and Medea can respond. Who would like to ask a question first?
Hi, Alice Slater. I'm with this new network that Medea is part of too. It's called World Beyond War. And I'm wondering, with this moment, with Hillary saying she's going to do a no-fly zone in Syria, which means she's going to drop bombs on them, I mean, why? I know it's great that we're focusing on Israel, we're focusing on Saudi Arabia, but maybe all of America needs to focus that we're the biggest arms salesperson in the world, and how do we expand that conversation? I know World Beyond War is going to start looking stuff up and having some information so that we're telling them to divest from every kind of weapon, not just Israeli and Saudi, but everybody.
That's what I was referring to. not just weapons around one particular country that we're either giving or selling to, but the weapons industry as a whole. And when we talk about Syria, I think we have to talk about arms embargo to the region, and as part of that is this divestment campaign.
You know, as we talk about Syria, a lot of the conversation is about you know, they need to stop the dropping of bombs in the no-fly zone or increased bombing. But I think we need to remember that there, in the last year, in 2015, and the same average is going to be for 2016, we dropped 26,000 bombs on targets in Iraq and Syria. So, you know, we can say we need to stop the idea of dropping bombs to enforce a no-fly zone. We need to stop dropping bombs now. So, you know, we talk about mobilizing to stop something that's coming. We need to be mobilizing to stop what's happening. And you know, as Medea was talking about, it's not just Syria, it's Yemen, it's Israel-Palestine. So yes, it is broader. And it's the arms trade, but it's also the militarized response to conflict across the board.
My question goes back to what Alice was also saying. In the 60s, we talked about converting war to peace. And it is now 2016, and we have not made very much progress. Considering that we even use Israel as a conduit for us to sell arms all over the world, to over 100 countries, including China, which Israel does, whether it's on our behalf or their behalf, I don't know. The war business and the arms business is the biggest business in the world, maybe next to drugs. Really, how can we change this? I mean, really, what really are those steps that we need to consider taking to end this? And since we are one of the biggest sellers, what really can we do? Because this is not an issue that's new. So I raise that.
I mean, to me, part of it is offset costs. In that, you know, war business is impacting all of us. It's you know, of the discretionary budget that the U.S. has that covers all of the spending that we need on education and healthcare and science and agriculture and social welfare and benefits and all of those things. 60% of that budget goes to the military. Right? So that leaves 40% for the rest of us. You know, and that's big business, but that's big business that impacts all of us. So how do we speak to people about that and about those offset costs? You know, in a situation when there needs to be a push for more progressive change overall. No, it's a hard thing to challenge, but it is calling attention to, in some ways, the costs here at home, and while raising up the costs abroad a bit. Yeah.
Well, we did have a very vibrant peace movement under Bush, and that peace movement died under Obama. The silver lining in the next administration is nobody's going to be under the illusion that there's a peace president in the White House, and that people are going to be more stimulated to pressure Hillary Clinton. And that is an opening for us. The fact that we haven't been able to stop the wars that Obama has continued is a failure of us, the peace movement. The fact that we've sold so many weapons to Saudi Arabia is because we haven't demanded that it stop. So we have to really think of how we're going to build a new kind of peace movement under the next administration. And that has to be movement that is really very much linked to other movements. We've got to reach out to folks in the environmental movement to say there is no real solution to the climate crisis without peace. If you can't work with the Russians, if you can't work with the international community because you're busy fighting them, you'll never have agreements that can be implemented. And of course, so many of the wars now are resource wars. The Black Lives Matter movement has already made the opening there for us, not only by connecting intimately to the issue of Palestine, but also by saying in their platform that the military-industrial complex sucking up all of this money is keeping that money from going into the communities and leading to mass incarceration. So they've given us the opening. We have to meet with them. We have to take that opening. We have to really show solidarity and connections. The issues of the folks working on money in politics. I mean, what bigger issue is there than the weapons industry to show the corruption of money in politics? And on, there are so many ways that we have to do a better job of building a peace movement that is diverse, that's intersectional, that's intergenerational, and we've got a chance to do it now under Hillary Clinton. And also, the peace movement has to be global. We did have that. Remember, we had on February 15, 2003, the largest mass protest in the history of the world on any issue. And we need to rebuild the global movement. I was just at the Stop the War Coalition in the UK, and it's the Stop the War Coalition in the UK that actually first called for that global day of protests. They are way stronger than we are here because they have Jeremy Corbyn as head of the Labour Party, who would be like Nancy Pelosi being out in the streets urging people to come out and call for an end to all war. So they are recognizing the fact that they are in a good position now to be rebuilding up that global peace movement. In fact, they just sent me a statement that we're trying to refine because it's so hard around Syria, something that we can get global community to call on. And Hillary Clinton is unfortunately going to demand from us action because she's going to drive us into deeper and deeper into wars, and then we're going to have to be not waiting for that, but building this global community in a new way now. And maybe we should talk about the ways that we can do that. There are people that are already calling for protests at Hillary Clinton's campaign headquarters here in New York City and other places around the statements that she's made around the no-fly zone. I think that's a great idea, and I think whatever we can do to start now, we should do.
I'd like to ask you why we can't leverage the money that we give to Israel on the basis of settlements. All that money goes to Israel. A lot of that money should be going to the Palestinians for education, So why can't we say no more money until you free the West Bank or something like that? It sounds so utopian.
You know, in effect, that's what we've been saying is that the aid to Israel needs to end. That it's now going up to $3.8 billion a year that will be going to Israel to fund the weapons and to fund the military and by extension the occupation and to fund the human rights abuses that are ongoing there and that money needs to end. That fundamentally U.S. policy needs to change. That it's not enough to just say, oh, settlements are unhelpful. Well, thank you very much, but that doesn't change the fact that settlements are growing at a record pace. It doesn't change the expropriation of land and the demolition of homes that accompanies that, or the movement restrictions that settlements put in place in people's lives. And yes, U.S. Policy needs to change in Israel. But Medea and I were talking just after her presentation, and there's a recognition also that the money that goes to Israel is very much tied up with Saudi Arabia and the other parts of the Arab world. That the U.S. has committed to providing Israel a qualitative military edge. What does that mean? And they've done that in writing, so that's there. That's a part of the agreement with Israel. It means that the U.S. commits to providing Israel with the weapons it needs and the support it needs so that it could defeat anyone else in the Middle East who might threaten it. And what that means is that it will not sell Saudi Arabia, despite its billions of dollars of weapons sales. It will not sell Saudi Arabia or any other country in the region weapons that Israel doesn't have the next step up, that Israel doesn't have more and better weapons. And so, they're tied with each other. So the newest jets that are here, billions of dollars that nobody wants to buy, that the U.S. didn't really want to buy to build, but the arms industry wanted, we sold them to Israel. We did that by selling Saudi Arabia the next jets down the line and said, they have them now, you better get the next upgrade. And we really forced them on, we forced those jets onto Israel who didn't want them. And then the money through the aid comes back to us. So there's this whole cycle in which money is going to Israel to come back to the U.S. And that's a change in the newest aid package to Israel that actually needs to be noted, because it's a loss for Israel. The reason that Israel was so upset about the last aid deal was that previously they got their $3.2 billion from the U.S., and they could spend a large portion of that on their domestic weapons industry, which meant that it was money into the Israeli economy. This latest agreement with Israel, because the U.S. was upset over settlements and other things, took that away. So now all that money that we give to Israel, the $3.8 billion, comes right back to us. So they get the weapons, they send the money out, it has to buy U.S. weapons. So it's $3.8 billion to Israel, to our weapons industry. And by allowing Israel to buy those weapons, then Saudi needs to buy the next ones up. And it's a whole cycle.
Just another comment on that. One of the great things that happened under the Obama administration was the Iran nuclear deal. But as a consolation prize to Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel gets a higher amount, a dollar amount from us, and the Saudis get U.S. participation in the bombing of Yemen. So, this is the U.S. example of diplomacy at work. And diplomacy at work, yes, it's terrible. I mean, with these, quote, side agreements.
One of the things I found quite ironic during this election cycle is suddenly the right has embraced WikiLeaks, and I've been saying for the past few days, ads put up about how bad Saudi Arabia is and what we've done. This is actually running in the right-wing campaigns now. So I'm hoping that some way we can harness their hatred for Clinton into going after her with us. And I keep saying to people I know, well, help us, attack this. And so maybe there's a way we can spread this a little bit by making it an anti-Clinton thing, and that the right will join us on. I don't know, but watch for this though. They love Julian Assange now. They think they're saying that Saudi Arabia is terrible, and they're putting up just what you said today, all the things that we're doing there in terms of the role of women. Primarily, that's what they're. And why are we taking money from these people and giving them things? So let's use that if we can.
Let's just remember the danger of that in terms of the way they position it as part of Islamophobia and feeding into this is the way Muslims are, and it feeds into Donald Trump's we don't want Muslims coming to this country and that kind of thing. So if we do reach out to them, we've also got to try to educate them.
Coming up in January, the cost of living increase for Social Security is $4 a month. $4 a month. We don't have money for a decent cost of living increase.
I think that we need some kind of vision for the future that is positive and also a response to current crises. I'm thinking about the refugee crisis coming out of wars where the war economy and war Keynesianism has finally come to its bankrupt conclusion, producing massive amounts of human destruction and the wretched refuse going everywhere, and being a major destabilizing element in the world, and it's a crisis that needs attention. And the second part of the refugee crisis is at least part of the problem has been climate change. In Syria, in the whole Arab Spring, the droughts that caused destabilization of these corrupt old regimes, creating, again, a crisis that needs addressing, and that's a global response of a sustainable world economy. And that's a positive reorientation that is beyond, the moral issues which we address, to saying there's a better way to use our scarce resources for a positive future in which we can survive. And I think that that's an orientation which I would like to see us put forward.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And at Codepink, we found that we were losing so much support because people were tired of protesting and tired of all the negative and the negative. And so we started a campaign called Grow the Local Peace Economy, where people could come up with creative ideas, and where we had a vision that was a different kind of economy that incorporates the issue of sustainability, of buy local, of grow local, but yet with the vision of a larger global community that works together. And I think certainly out of the Bernie Sanders campaign, there's a lot of young people who got educated and turned on and realized that capitalism wasn't serving them well. That when they were lucky enough to get an education in college, they found that they were strapped with tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands, in debt, and it didn't have to be like that. And the jobs that were the options for them were not ones that were the kind of things that they wanted to work for. So you see a lot of young people who are forming their own ideas about what kind of collective workplaces they could do together, what kind of new ways that they could earn a living. And I think it's all very positive. When I travel overseas, I also see a lot more of that envisioning, because people understand that we can't have an economy that's focused on growth. It just means an end to the planet we live on, that it's got to be more about quality of life, quality of community, quality of healthcare, quality of happiness. And so I totally agree with you. We have to put that out there as the positive vision where we want to go.
And maybe looking backwards to look forwards a little bit, between 2005 and 2007, I did a lot of work in Yemen, and I was in and out of Yemen every couple months during that period. And I remember a particular trip in, I think, 2006, when I was in Sana'a, in the capital, and I had a meeting at the U.S. consulate with some of the consular staff there about Yemen, and they found out that I was, at the time I was based in San Francisco, and they found out I was traveling back through Washington, D.C. on my way back. And that I was going to have some meetings at the State Department at the time. And so they told me, the guys at the consulate basically said, okay, if you're going back into D.C., talk with them about Yemen, yell at them about Yemen. I mean, basically begging and saying this place is going to explode, that Yemen is going to break down into war, because, as somebody who, my background academically is conflict, and if you look at the indicators of conflict and what it is that you might say that a conflict is likely, you had every single one there in Yemen. You had a history of civil war between the North and the South. At the time, you had ongoing conflict in the North, war fighting between the Houthis, the Ziadi community in the North, and the government. You had a huge youth population that was largely unemployed. That was the poorest country in the Middle East, a dwindling water supply, no natural resources to speak of, more guns than people in the country. All of these things, population where young people, because they didn't have jobs, were going to Iraq at that time to fight and coming back, and after they were coming back, joining groups like Al-Qaeda, which is having a growing presence in the country and destabilizing the country. And as the poorest country in the region, with all of these all of these things, the U.S. was giving less than $20 million a year in development assistance, which, is, in terms of development assistance, is a tiny amount. But during that period, we were increasing our drone bombing in the country radically. And each of those bombs is about $1 million. 20 bombs, that's the development country in the world, and development assistance in the country. So what are you doing? You're bombing a country and not giving any money. And what is the bombing doing? It's destabilizing the country. So while the country is destabilizing, the consular staff who recognize what's going on is screaming for some kind of attention to be paid to the country, we're increasing our bombing, providing more assistance to the government, which is repressing its own people, and all of these things are further destabilizing the country, leading to a breakdown eventually and to the situation. Now, that's not in any way to excuse the absolute brutality of the Saudi bombing in the country, but all of these dynamics are at play there, and the U.S. recognized them. I mean, I think that's something that we need to say, is that the U.S. knew that all of this was there. And now, could we have done something that would have necessarily stopped the breakout of war? Maybe not. I mean, this is, now 10 years ago, and all of these dynamics were at play, and there were a lot of things that very complicated history and politics and things that who knows if you could have done something to stop that. But we weren't. And so what does that mean? And so the reason that I say that in terms of a future-looking policy, it's not enough for us just to say that we need to stop bombing different countries. We need to stop bombing other countries. But we also need to be looking at what is guiding our foreign policy. Is it a foreign policy that's based on the fear of the potential threat that somebody else provides, that somebody else poses to us? Is that what guides us? Are we a policy based on fear, and that's what we have? Or is it a foreign policy that's based on opportunity, the recognition that there is potential in other places, and that needs to be furthered and developed, and that people need to be supported to grow and to develop and to have the opportunities that we would want for ourselves, and that by having those opportunities and freedoms, our security is provided. And it's a transformed way of looking at the world. So it's not just that we need to stop and say, let's stop bombing. But for all of us, let's stop looking at the rest of the world through eyes that are full of fear.
I have a practical question. BDS is kind of a moving target. Companies are moving in and out of it. You just mentioned, I think, SodaStream was now off the list. Is there a way to keep up with that list? It must be constantly changing.
SodaStream's not necessarily off the list. I mean, SodaStream has moved its production facilities from the West Bank, and so they've pulled out of the West Bank, but they've moved then into the Negev in the south of Israel, which is an area where the Bedouin population is being displaced and people are being uprooted from their homes, and there's a lot of exploitation there. And so there is still an active campaign targeting SodaStream. But you're right. I mean, things do change. I mean, it's one of the realities of targeting companies. So Veolia, for example, which was doing business in Israel and Palestine, has ended its contracts. And so for Israel-Palestine, it's off that list, and yet it's still a pretty terrible company that's privatizing water and that others are targeting for other reasons. And there are changes. There isn't a single centralized list of companies. There are, I mean, part of what BDS is about is it's about particular campaigns. So, I mean, you can't, the Boycott National Committee is the Palestinian organization that represents the Palestinians who called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They maintain information about various boycott campaigns. We have at AFSC put together a website called Investigate, and so it's afsc.org. investigate, and it's an online tool that you can use for screening investments. And we maintain in that a updated list of companies and information about companies that are publicly traded in the U.S. That you might be invested in or that you might consider for boycott. And we divide that into a couple of categories, including those who we think you should just look at and be concerned about, and others specifically recommended for divestment based on their actions. It's a limited list, though. It's not comprehensive because it is limited to companies that are publicly traded. So it won't include a company that is a private company, perhaps that's not one that you can invest in that you might want to boycott. But that's one place. The U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights now, the changed name for the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, maintains a list, but there isn't one centralized place. Who Profits is an Israeli organization. Also that maintains information on companies that are complicit in occupation, in settlements, in violence, and they also maintain a list of companies.
I'd just like to take up something that Medea said at the end, how one can build a campaign against U.S. support for Saudis, because the success of the BDS movement, which has been, I think, way beyond anyone's expectations. It's extraordinary, I think. Even a lot of the, Justice in Palestine groups didn't like the right of return plank, and, they were not for the BDS movement. Anyway, but it's just taken off incredibly, despite the attacks on it. Anyway, but I think that the level of support and the reasons for support of Israel are, very strong. But I don't think there are hardly any Americans who would support the Saudis unless they're, in the weapons industry. So if we can publicize, more what is going on, why are we supporting them, and what can we do to, I think it would have tremendous support among Americans, if that doesn't sound too naive. But once you put it out there, why? I think, we have to think about how to concretize and make up some demands.
We need the same kind of really good research that went into the BDS campaign to do on Saudi Arabia, because it's not obvious. Saudi products tend to be oil. And, what are you going to say? Don't buy oil. The Saudis have bought big refineries in Texas. No way to say don't use those refineries. They don't sell a lot of just products that you can point to, although there are so many companies that have Saudi investment in them that you could then focus on those companies. I gave the example of Uber, but there are lots of them. So the research hasn't been done, and then the shaping of the campaigns, because they won't be Saudi companies, they'll be U.S. companies, so it's one removed. We've just got to do some more crafting of what the campaigns would look like. But we're certainly open to anybody who wants to work and help develop that.
My question is trying to get away from the kind of racketeering relationship with the circular arms sales deals, and concentrate on what people in Palestine can do for themselves, such as the American Friends Service Committee has had for a long time the equal exchange. They sponsored that development project, and I noticed that they're now selling olive oil from the West Bank, and I'm just wondering if there's a way to get people from our country to invest in these local things, to bring more resource into the resource poor places that can then reach out and get their products out, get their name out, get their self-motivation out. And that's one way to get even people in Saudi Arabia in front of American people, who can then sympathize with them and try to go further into the political realm.
I think we sold olive oil It was quite a while ago. It was before I came on. We haven't done it recently. Not for AFSC, but other organizations are. I mean, there are free trade cooperatives that are coming out of the Canaan Cooperative and others that are in the West Bank that are producing olive oil and selling that through various places. No, it's not for AFSC. We haven't taken on olive oil.
Equal exchange. It's a different company.
Equal exchange. It's different.
I guess it's broken away from AFSC.
Yeah, it's not, but yeah, other organizations are definitely doing that, and as much as we can support those Palestinian organizations and groups that are pushing for self-sustainability, that are trying to build up their opportunities there, that's something that's important to do, and to see how it is that we can support those communities. But to recognize that support that's going to those communities isn't a replacement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions or other actions to bring change. That they can be complementary things maybe that go hand in hand, but to recognize that really full development and independent development and sustainable development isn't something that can be achieved under a situation of continued military occupation. And so the support for those kind of communities and based programs is important, but it's also a bit of a Band-Aid. And understanding that Band-Aid isn't sustainable, and really what we need to be doing is treating the wound that's underneath, and that's the denial of rights that's inherent in occupation and the other things that are there, and so pushing for an end to those things.
I really like what Medea said about bringing a lot of movements together. A friend who I just met here made a comment that it's very unfortunate that there aren't many people the age bracket of any of my kids here or younger than that. And we really need their energy. I was here for Occupy Wall Street, and we need that kind of upsurge of energy. We need that kind of movement building that I saw for the Global Climate March that happened here a couple of years ago. So we really need to erase some of the barriers that are in between our separate movements and show that peace is not only part of every other movement, it's the first step. It's like the house is on fire. What are you going to do? Go work in the garden? And right now, I would like to voice my total support for BDS in every way, shape, and form, and I think it's disgusting that people like our own governor are making moves against it, are going through the college system and trying to clamp down on it and not let people to voice their disapproval for what Israel is doing in a peaceful way. And that is just outrageous to me, that they can get away with doing that they've so infiltrated our government that they can come after you if you advocate BDS, and that's disgusting to me. And then another thing, I felt morally wounded that Israel got away with clamping down on that boatload of women that came to try to break the blockade. That was very heroic. It got zero coverage in the press, and they figured that, that it was okay because they didn't murder anybody this time. They sent in women soldiers to manhandle the people in a more genteel way. But I think that we should be able to get separate little boatloads. I don't know. I remember those kayak activists that managed to kick people out of the Arctic. That we should be able to get enough kayaktivists that are willing to go over with little bits of real aid, and just kind of catch them off guard, and they'll be out there. They won't be out there with a spotlight on them singing songs, but they'll be out there with, a little bit of permaculture and a little bit of health coaching and a little bit of this and that, and they'll just be coming in. And I don't think Israel would be able to dispose of them that easily. I think that we need to catch these folks off guard. And I think that's one wonderful thing that Codepink has always been able to do. It's always warmed my heart and amazed me. And I thought one of the greatest things was the vagina suit that Codepink came up with to keep the Republican Party out of our reproductive choices. And I would like to see something like that devised with restraints in it, so someone could pop up at a Trump campaign and slap it on that monster and put him in restraints and say, this is what it feels like getting grabbed back, you know, and don't let him move for the next 2 or 3 hours, you know. But I think that, you know, the mileage that we've had with Codepink is indescribable. I remember when Obama himself, when he was interrupted, he said, someone should listen to that woman. And that's the one piece of advice that he came out with in his entire administration that I think people should listen to, you know. So, you know, I think that it's wonderful and excellent, and a terrible thing would be to scold us for the fact that our group is small here and that we are the age that we are. I think it's great that this happened. I'm so sorry I got here late. I got stuck on the subway. But I think that, you know, what's happening here with Medea's new book and all of these events is that, you know, in the big pool of consciousness, a stone gets thrown in and it doesn't just sink to the bottom, it ripples outward. And that's what we have to do here, is to ripple outward to the best degree that we can. So thank you so much for being here and for being my friend.
It's really striking how this whole deception is so simple that I think that's what makes it seem incredible to people. Because if you say, well, you know, they're funding them and then they're funding them, and it's so blatant that it's hard to even convince people that it's the truth because it's so ridiculous. You know, which is really a genius move on their part to do something that's just so completely over the top by funding Saudi Arabia. You know what I mean? When you tell people who haven't really researched it, they think you're insane. And the other thing was, sometimes I think our country is kind of stuck in like 1968 over and over again, because if you saw Ehrlichman came out and said the war on drugs was done on purpose to harass black people and the anti-war movement, because he said that gave us an excuse to break up their meetings and harass them and arrest them and stuff like that. And here we are now in the same exact situation, because what's going on now is we have the anti-war movement and the Black Lives Matter movement going on. So it just seems to me like we've been stuck for almost 50 years living out the same conflict. And if they went to the length of inventing a war on drugs just to stop the anti-war movement, that makes you understand how important it is. You know, like measuring it by how much they hate it and are trying to suppress it. But it's just amazing to me how they could do something so blatantly ridiculous, and when you tell people, they think it can't be true because it sounds insane. And just so simple, you know, it's not even sneaky. It's just mind-blowing to me.
You know, for me, the youth in this movement, or in the various movements, there's actually is one of the places where there's so much going on, you know, at the college level, and that's the place where the connections are really being made across movements, as Medea was talking about. You know, the people in the Students for Justice in Palestine movement at the college level who are making connections with those who are protesting for water rights right now, with those who are protesting in the Black Lives Matter movement, with those who are pushing for justice on so many issues, that those connections are happening and are happening in really dynamic ways that you know, is really encouraging to see coming from you know, a youth movement. The people who I don't see are my own age bracket mostly, and perhaps we need to do better with childcare at events and ways of making things accessible. But you know, you get into the midlife era and things seem to drop off. But the youth movement is moving, and I think it's also, you know, it's not just that. It's different than when, you know, when I was a student 20 years ago. There is a a real movement for social change, and I think you saw it in some of the movement for Bernie Sanders and for others in this political movement. There's a recognition that things do need to change, and I think that there is, to me, an encouraging move towards social justice and towards accountability that I think that we're all tying into. And granted, there are a lot of forces that are large and difficult to challenge, who are pushing against the things that we want, but I think inexorably, kind of we're moving in the right direction slowly on some of these things. And I say that, looking back for myself now, this fall was 20 years from my first trip to Israel and Palestine, and seeing that situation deteriorate over that period of time, but also in some ways the openness for activism and for hearing Palestinian voices be something that's fundamentally transformed in a direction that's better. And so the deterioration is going hand in hand with a push for social change and a raising awareness that there does need to be change. And I see that in other areas and in other movements as well, that the discouragement we see in many ways with the growing inequality in the country, with the growing racial animus, with the Islamophobia and the other things that are in many ways plaguing us and a part of the political culture that we have, are also being accompanied by growing movements who are pushing for something that's different. So I think that when I come to these events and talk with people and see the commitment that there is for change, and see how kind of the empowerment that to me comes through BDS and that comes through other pushes that are being put forward for real social change, that there is a possibility of something that's different, that despite the discouragement that can come with all of this, I think, we can all be pushing together towards, and hopefully we can realize something that's transformed.
Well, I want to echo what Mike says, because I think as I travel around with this book, one of the best things has been seeing what's happening in other communities. And sure, it's an electoral season, so a lot of people are focusing on the elections. But even so, I was just in Arizona and seeing the young people who are not just getting out the vote, but are focusing on getting rid of people like Sheriff Arpaio in Phoenix, and the vibrancy of the immigrant rights movement that's going to come back up to hit Hillary Clinton and the you-know-what. I think there's a lot of movement going on in different places that we might not see in our mainstream media, but it is there. Certainly on the Palestine issue, there's a lot of young people involved. In fact, it's one of the most vibrant movements on campuses today. And I think in the rest of the peace movement, we have to understand our issues have been very muddled over these last 8 years. It's been very hard to even see what wars we are in. So it's not just our inability to reach out, it's the fact that things have been very obscure. And I think they're not going to be so obscure under the next administration. And I think that we're going to have to be ready there for a movement that young people are going to get and understand and want to be part of. And it is because we are going to have a hawk in the White House, and a lot of things are going to become a lot clearer than they were under the Obama administration. That is a negative, but there is the positive underlying that, which means our movements will grow, our movements will be much more interconnected, and I think we have to start the reaching out now so that we're ready for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thanks to all of you for coming. I know we're a small group, but I think we're really high quality. So thank you so much for coming out on a Sunday afternoon.